Those who want to be in the kingdom of heaven must obey the law of God and have a righteousness that is superior to the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees. That's what we saw in chapter 5 of Matthew, verses 17 through 20. In that section, that I believe sets the stage for what Jesus begins to talk about in this study. As we continue thinking about the Sermon on the Mount and how Jesus is describing his radical kingdom, how righteousness goes so much deeper than the righteousness that was commonly demonstrated by the Pharisees and the scribes. The righteousness Jesus teaches is one that cuts deep into the heart, into the very core, the very being of each person. And throughout this section that we're in now, starting in verse 21 and running through the end of chapter 5, verse 48, this section, in it, Jesus gives 6 case studies in righteousness, and showing that righteousness goes deeper than prevailing concepts of righteousness. So often people may have thought what righteousness looked like, but Jesus shows that's not all. It goes so much deeper than that. And so in this lesson, we're going to look at just the first 3 of these case studies as we focus on Matthew 5 and verses 21 through 32. Well, let's begin thinking about the first of these case studies in righteousness and thinking about murder. And it's chapter 5, verse 21 through 26. Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said to our ancestors, 'Do not murder, and whoever murders will be subject to judgment.' But I tell you, everyone who is angry with his brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Whoever insults his brother or sister will be subject to the court. Whoever says, 'You fool,' will be subject to hellfire. So if you are offering your gift on the altar and there you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First, go and be reconciled with your brother or sister, and then come and offer your gift. Reach a settlement quickly with your adversary while you're on the way with him to the court, or your adversary will hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the officer, and you will be thrown into prison. Truly, I tell you, you will never get out of there until you have paid the last penny." Now, remember that Jesus, when he talks about this phrase, right, you have heard that it was said to our ancestors, you have heard that it was said, we're going to see this 6 times, I believe, as you look at this whole section. Okay, here's what you've heard, here's what you've seen. Jesus is not setting himself in opposition to the law and the prophets of the Old Testament. Remember, the section that we have just concluded in verses 17 through 20 demonstrate he's not the insurrectionist that people had come to accuse him of being. He didn't come to abolish or overthrow the law or the prophets. He came to fulfill them. And so Jesus isn't against the law and the prophets. What Jesus is setting up a contrast with is against the common interpretation and practice of the law. Here's what righteousness looks like: the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees. Remember, that's the contrast that he began, and it is our transition point here in verse 20. And now being continued on, okay, here's what righteousness often is said to look like, but here's what I tell you. And so regarding murder, right, it was commonly held that those who commit murder would be subject to standing before the town court in judgment. Of course, murder does not fit with righteousness. Now, murder is, of course, killing without just cause. And so these people knew that doesn't fit with righteousness. It was certainly contrary to one of the 10 commandments in Exodus 20 and verse 13. And there's other passages in the law of Moses that shows the consequences, even physical consequences for one who murders. Exodus 21 verses 12 through 14. Numbers 35 verses 16 through 21. Numbers 35 verses 30 and 31. So murder and righteousness don't fit, but they were accustomed to understanding that. Even the Pharisees and the scribes could understand that, and their righteousness did not include murder. And so while these individuals, they rightly held that murder must be avoided, and certainly even in God's kingdom today, murder must be avoided. It is something that is wrong. It doesn't fit with righteousness. But what was the problem is they were not nearly as concerned about other abusive conduct toward others. They were careful not to murder, but their righteousness allowed for, righteousness in quotes, right, allowed for this other kind of abusive conduct. So Jesus demonstrates that righteousness goes deeper in how you treat other people, the dignity that you place on other people and their value, their worth, than just not murdering. Jesus demonstrates that anger and verbal abusiveness makes one equally unrighteous before God as if one commits murder. So you can just imagine being in the audience and hearing these words for the first time. How radical of an idea that this is. That the words that I say can also make me unrighteous before God. It's not just this righteousness that I've often seen, and as long as I'm not committing murder, I'm good. Note that he used the language of being subject to the judgment of a local court and the highest court, the Sanhedrin, to make the point of their guilt before God. And then he demonstrates how serious these offenses are in the use of the word hellfire. Now, by and large, Jesus is the one who uses this word in the New Testament. James also will use the word for hell. But Jesus is the one who uses it, and he's referencing, he uses the Greek word Gehenna, okay, where this is referencing Gehenna of fire, which is a reference to the valley that was south, the valley of Hinnom that was south of Jerusalem. And this is a place that was a big garbage dump, and all manner of filth was burned. So Jesus uses this image that was known to the people that he was talking to at that time, but he's not talking about them being thrown into this literal place, but he's using it to depict a future eternal punishment, a place where although man can kill the body, God is able to destroy both soul and body in hell, Matthew 10, verse 28. Or in Mark 9, verses 43 through 48, where he uses the word several times, where this is a fire that will never be quenched, where the worm doesn't die. So this is clearly being used in a sense of a spiritual and eternal place of punishment and not just a physical place. So this is what's at stake, Jesus is showing. Now, although anger is an emotion that God has created us to experience, right, it does have its proper place when it's properly directed, like towards sin, when we see Jesus was angry towards sin in Mark 3 and in verse 5. But Jesus seems to be using it here in the sense of being angry in a loveless way. In Ephesians 4, verse 26, for example, Paul writes about being angry but not sinning. So we can experience the anger of emotion and then bring it under control But when we use this emotion of anger and then don't bring it under control, and it's demonstrated to others in a loveless way, then we're guilty before God just as much as we are guilty if we committed murder. 1 John 3 and verse 15, if we hate, it is equated with murder. And so we can see Jesus raising the bar. Don't just think that as long as you don't murder, you've checked the box for righteousness. No, you treat people in the proper way. Jesus then gives examples of the way one may be guilty before God through our hateful words. These are insulting another, using the word raka, for example, which is an Aramaic term that insults a person's intelligence as if the one is empty-headed, right? That's the idea. Again, do you see how that undermines a person's dignity, how that undermines who God has created them to be? You're just spouting off in your anger and hatred and disrespect toward other people, using such insults against them, and calling another a fool. So Jesus is showing us a deeper level of righteousness. And then Jesus goes on and shows an even deeper level of righteousness. So even at this point, he's not done. Yes, our words matter. How we treat other people matters to our righteousness. But Jesus goes to an even deeper level of righteousness by demonstrating the need for a person to seek reconciliation with a brother or sister who has something against you because of your unrighteousness. So if you have done something against another, if they've got something against you and you know about it, you go make sure you take care of it. Citizens of Jesus' kingdom are not to proceed with their worship offerings to God if they have unresolved sin toward another. I don't think you can just keep going on your merry way and trying to serve God if you're not willing to correct the sin that you've committed against another. Psalm 51, verses 16 through 17, that passage shows us David recognizing after his sin that it's not just about offering these physical offerings as they were to do and under the old law that made one pleasing to God, but he talks about the sacrifice of the humble and contrite heart being pleasing, acceptable to God. In Isaiah 1, verses 10 through 18, in that passage, it talks about how the festivals and sacrifices and so forth that the Israelites were involved in and offering to God, they were wearisome to God, that God hated them because they weren't living right. 1 Peter 3 and verse 7 demonstrates to husbands how if we fail to treat our wives in the way that he desires, the way that God desires, well, then our prayers are going to be hindered before God. Same points in verses 10 through 12 about how the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. So we can bring all kinds of physical expressions of our devotion to God, but if we're not living right, then it doesn't make us right with God. And certainly this involves, as Jesus is showing here, if we're not treating other people right. Note that others may be unwilling to be reconciled. So when there's two people, we might go and we might try to make things right, try to do our part, but Jesus is demonstrating a heart that desires and attempts to live peaceably with all and to correct our wrongs. Romans 12, verses 16 through 18. You see, taking care of wrongs quickly, as Jesus goes on to show here, while they're small, will keep them from growing, and the consequences, physically and perhaps spiritually, from becoming more severe, or at least getting to a place where it's harder to come back from. And so that's the first of these case studies regarding righteousness that Jesus demonstrates. It's not just about checking the box that you don't murder, but it's about how you treat people even down to your words and your anger. But a second case study for us to think about is that of adultery. And we look in Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 through 30. You have heard that it was said, do not commit adultery. But I tell you, everyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. So again, thinking about the contrast, as you see, you've heard that it was said. The contrast is not Jesus against the old law and the prophets, but Jesus against the perception of righteousness that was common in the scribes and the Pharisees. And it was commonly held that one should not commit adultery, right? And that agreed with the old law in the 10 Commandments in Exodus 20 and verse 14. So they could understand that. They understood that that was part of being righteous was not to commit adultery. However, they appear to have stopped at staying away from the physical act of adultery that would make them subject to a capital offense under the Mosaic law. This was a serious physical problem if you committed adultery under the law of Moses. Look at Leviticus 20 and verse 10 and Deuteronomy 22, verse 22. So here are these scribes and the Pharisees, and they understood and evidently abode by the law of not committing adultery. So they could check that box. But Jesus demonstrates that unrighteousness is not limited to this. Unrighteousness is not limited to failing to control oneself in this way, where you would go and commit the physical act of adultery. But Jesus is demonstrating that true righteousness even extends to your thoughts. And so Jesus shows even to lustful thoughts toward others, that's what's involved in righteousness. You don't even do that. Exodus 20, verse 17, in fact, during the 10 Commandments, it wasn't just don't commit adultery. It wasn't even to covet your neighbor's wife. Job 31, verse 1, talks about how Job had made a covenant with his eyes not to look on a young woman to lust after her. And so the law of God already demonstrated that there was more involved than just the not committing the physical act of adultery. But notice how raising the bar to this level, it would cut to the source of adulteries. Adultery stem from the lust of the heart. Matthew 15, verses 18 through 19. And so you need to solve it at its core. Now, like anger and verbal abuse is just as unrighteous as murder, looking with lustful intent at another, looking at another as an object to fulfill personal desire, is just as unrighteous as adultery. Right? They are both unrighteous before God. Don't just think that you can check the box of you have not committed the physical act of adultery as making you then righteous before God. How's your heart? Are you pure in your heart, as we saw back in chapter 5 in the Beatitudes? The seriousness of this unrighteousness, of looking at another with lustful intent, is emphasized by Jesus speaking about gouging out the eye and cutting off the right hand. Now you can compare this. He uses this same kind of imagery in Matthew 18, verses 8 and 9, and Mark 9, verses 43 through 48. And he's demonstrating the seriousness of hell. You don't want to go to hell. In fact, you need to do everything you can so you don't go there. So you think about like a limb that's got gangrene. You need to amputate it to save the entire body. Well, if your right eye is what's causing you to sin, if that's the source, gouge it out. If it's your right hand, cut it off. So Jesus demonstrates the need to amputate anything from our lives that would cause us to sin and be cast into hell. For he says it's better to sacrifice something temporary like your eye or your hand than to experience the eternal punishment and the fires of hell. That's how serious of a matter this is. Now, you might note, I don't believe physical mutilation is Jesus' ultimate point. One could still lust with the left eye after the right eye was removed. But certainly you think about, he's showing the great seriousness of sin and unrighteousness, and treating it serious, because what's at stake is spending eternity in hell if you don't get it fixed. And so what might actually fix it, more than gouging out the eye or cutting off the hand, would be the amputation of things, of environments, of relationships, etc. Things that are pulling us into sin. Certainly these things would apply. You think about things in this light, and if there is a problem with pornography and looking certainly intentionally to lust after another with lustful intent, pornography certainly fits that bill. Well, maybe you need to cut off the television or the internet or the phone or whatever it might be that is the source that's coming through. You see, both lustful looks, the eye, and lustful acts, the hand, must be cut off and the heart corrected to be righteous. So don't just think that you can just check the box that you haven't committed adultery and be right with God. How's your heart? Maybe you're not committing adultery, but you are looking with lust-filled intent at others. And you're still treating them as an object for your own gratification and desire, and that is just as evil before God, just as unrighteous through lustful intent in looking, as it is with the physical act of adultery. So don't just think we can check the box and move on when you haven't committed the physical act of adultery, Jesus is showing. Righteousness goes deeper. It cuts to the heart. Now, a third case study in righteousness that Jesus demonstrates involves divorce, and that's verses 31 and 32. Jesus says, "It was also said, whoever divorces his wife must give her a written notice of divorce. But I tell you, everyone who divorces his wife, except in a case of sexual immorality, causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery." Now, it was commonly accepted that a man could give his wife a certificate of divorce if he found something unfavorable about her, although some held to strict views on divorce. Even under the Old Testament law, there was debate about it. Deuteronomy 24, verses 1 through 4, and you had different camps of people who held to different positions. Some that God would only allow for divorce under the case of sexual immorality. Others, if there was anything unfavorable, and a man could divorce his wife with a written notice of divorce. Jesus also made it clear that Moses permitted divorce in a broader sense than God desired in Matthew 19 and in verse 8. Moses permitted, but it was because of the hardness of their hearts, not because that was what God had desired. And Jesus sets it straight in throughout Matthew 19 there. Well, the Pharisees appear to have accepted, again, you've got this, you've heard it said section, and you notice that, again, Jesus is not against the old law, and he's not against the prophets, he's fulfilling them. But don't think, as the Pharisees appear to have accepted this broader sense of divorce, Matthew 19, verse 3, they asked Jesus the question, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any reason? Verse 7, they point to what Moses permitted. And so they appear to have accepted this broader sense of divorce, but they put the emphasis on the procedure of divorce, it would seem, making sure a certificate of divorce was given. So you can just imagine, again, the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees, divorcing their wives for whatever cause, of finding them unfavorable to them. But they're making sure to check that box of making sure that written notice was given. Well, this caused women, right, this divorcing them for just any cause, caused women to be treated as objects that could be discarded. And you can just imagine the hardship that certainly caused women under this, the way that the Pharisees and the scribes evidently practiced this, that they could just move on, make sure so they could be righteous with God to give this written notice of divorce, and then just cast them aside and go and get another woman. But Jesus demonstrates that unrighteousness is not the result of merely forsaking the certificate of divorce. Don't think that's all God cares about. But what God cares about, unrighteousness in the case of divorce, is not just about the procedure, but it is in divorcing a spouse for any cause except for sexual immorality. So you can't just toss out your wife and go and find another one, and that be okay with God. But instead, it's only for the cause of sexual immorality that Jesus permits here in verses 31 and 32. Now, this sexual immorality, it is a broad term that covers all forms of sexual intercourse outside of a God-approved marriage. And it's the same cause, the only cause, that Jesus gives in answering the question in Matthew 19, verses 1 through 12, about is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any cause, any reason? And Jesus says, no, a man and his wife are joined together by God when they marry. And so what God has joined together, man must not separate. And if he had stopped there, then there would be no exception. If he had stopped there, and of course this passage, if it did not exist, there would be no exception that was given. But Jesus gives this exception about sexual immorality. Again, any kind of sexual intercourse outside of a God-approved marriage. And so a husband or a wife stepping outside of the marriage relationship in these ways and having sexual intercourse with another. Now, Jesus says that permits someone to divorce his or her spouse. Divorce for any other cause and any subsequent remarriage results in adultery. Why? Because you're still bound to the first wife. So here's this Pharisee or scribe, you can imagine, they're diligent in giving a written notice of divorce, but they're divorcing for a reason that's different than sexual immorality, and they go off and they get into another marriage. He says that's adultery. They're still bound. That one's still bound to the first wife. And we see it's only the one who divorces his or her spouse for sexual immorality who's set free to remarry. Again, Matthew 19, verse 9 in particular. This result, the result of Jesus' marriage law, is a restoration to how things were intended to be in the beginning. You go back to Genesis, it's one man, one woman for life. It is a covenant relationship between one man, one woman for life. Malachi 2, verses 14 through 16. Even in the Old Testament times, God was rebuking those who were divorcing. Romans 7, verses 2 and 3 demonstrates the same thing Jesus is demonstrating here and in Matthew 19, about how these two are bound together by God. And you can't just discard that and go marry another. The result is adultery. It is sin to divorce for any reason other than sexual immorality. And any subsequent remarriage is adultery. So while they may have been careful to check the box of a procedure, Jesus is raising the bar of righteousness, as he's done throughout this section, as it relates to divorce. Well, as we close this section, righteousness in Jesus' kingdom looks radically different from what was common in the Pharisees and scribes. Jesus is clearly not just interested in mere formalities and traditions in the observances of one's religion. Instead, he desires hearts that truly love him and righteousness that flows from such committed hearts observing his laws.